Continuing with dimensional text, I'm moving on to the third letter, which is the R. Making this binding box around that gives me a sense of what I need to subtract and where these cross sections are. Where's the center of that curve? And then the stem coming off of the R, where does that happen within this rectangular box? I'm doing an approximate, it looks like thirds. So the round part of the R looks like it occupies the top 2/3. And the stem coming down on the right occupies about 1/3. So the rounded part of the R is called a counter. So I'm just going to tweak some of this to try to get the sense of the proportion of how much of that counter, that curved part of the R, is occupied within this rectangle. Looks like the farthest point of that counter is about the 1/3 mark. So I'm putting in the thickness of the back of the R, doing a quick measurement. A consideration for when you're doing these letters as at different depths from the viewer, you'll want to consider that as something gets further away, its scale changes. So that is like the height of the first letter compared to the third or fourth letter in this case. So within each one of those, so you can have a scale shift, but the proportions within each letter should remain the same. So I'm looking at the thickness of this, measuring it, so that within that particular letter, all of the thicknesses are the same. You can use this piece of paper to make little hash marks that are relevant measurements just for that letter. We don't need to measure and say, well, this is exactly 1/8 of an inch. You're making it relative to the letter, so if the thickness of the back of the R is a particular measurement, the curve should also be that same measurement. And just like in the D, I'm making little points along this curve so that whenever I draw it, I know that it has to go from one point through the next and to the final, and it should maintain a similar curve. I'm doing this very quickly, so I'm just putting in the starting point, the midpoint, and the end point, and it will get me fairly close. Now I'm going to work on this leg, the stem coming off of the bottom right of the R. It looks like it goes from that top left corner, getting an approximate measurement of where the back end of that's going to be. So I think that I can go from that point up through to that top left corner. This should give me a fairly decent sense of what that typeface is doing. Another thing that I'll want to look at is the bottom little triangle of this R. Is that a similar shape to what I'm seeing? A little bit off. It seems like it comes more to a point than what I have. So I may need to adjust this angle a little bit. Okay, the R is looking fairly decent. Now we're going to move on to the E. As you do this, you'll be glad whenever you come across certain letters that are a little bit easier than others. This, I basically have 4 segments that all have to be the same thickness. I'm going to put in this back of this E. Then it's just a matter of knowing where those 3 stems are coming off of the right. So I can measure this. Now I can do, that's the measurement for the first. If there's an equidistant space, I can put that in. I'm going to have to make an adjustment here. I'm going to use my T-square to do my horizontal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the bottom and the top of the letter, and then hopefully be able to figure out how to place that middle so that it looks proportionate and equidistant from the top and bottom. Here I'm making slight adjustments. By the thickness that I've made, it doesn't allow me to have a proper relationship between the negative space and the positive of the letter. To find this middle stem, I'm drawing from a corner to a corner within that rectangle, and this is going to give me the exact middle. Where those two diagonals cross is going to give me exact middle of that rectangle. So that needs to be the center of that stem, and then I can use my measurement to do the top and the bottom of that middle stem. And once I have the measurement for the top and the bottom of that middle section of the E, I use my T-square, and I'm going to lay in those perfectly horizontal lines. Last letter, the W. If I draw a rectangular box around this letter, I am automatically realizing that I've made an error in the width versus the height. This box is probably a little bit wider than it is tall compared to the rest of these. This isn't going to jive. So what I have to do is I have to make adjustments. If you look at the I and the J, those particular letters are going to be much narrower. So my first attempt at this, again, it should seem pretty easy. It's 4 equal width line segments, but then getting this to come out correctly within this box is a little bit tricky. Where the top of that W meets that rectangle, that's going to be dead center since it's a symmetrical letter. Using the corner to corner method, I can again find the middle of that box. So I'm going from midpoint down to corner. I can get the quarter marks. So I'm getting the halfway point, and then if you consider those as two separate rectangles beside each other, then you can subdivide those down by finding the midpoint. What I'm running into here is I still haven't figured out, and this is going to take some reworking, that overall proportion of my box is still a little bit too narrow. If I'm doing an equal width here and an equal width there, this is not going to fit. Okay, so pre-planning at the beginning, if you can get a more accurate sense of width versus height on your letters, it's really going to help at the end. I've got too much of a problem here. I'm trying to get too much width into a narrow box, and it's throwing me off. So don't be afraid. Get out your white eraser. You can quickly go in here and start to delete stuff. I can take out this incorrect W and rework that fairly quickly. So this is looking a little bit better. Again, corner to corner, I'm finding my midpoint. Where these two cross, that's going to be the absolute middle of that rectangle. I'm going to get an approximate sense of how thick these sides are and whether this is going to work. Find my midpoint at the top of that rectangle. You can see I'm sorting it out. So based off my letter, I know that the midpoint of each one of these V's has got to be in the middle of each rectangle on the side. So now, rather than going to a point in the middle, I'm doing these overlapping line segments to try to get the thickness of that W. A big part of this assignment is just working your way through each letter and getting a sense for how do I construct this letter with the width, the lines, the shapes, the proportions that are necessary for each letter. I think that I've got a decent sense now for how wide these letter segments need to be. I probably could have gone a bit wider. I'll talk about this in the final video where I critique this, things that I would do differently.